Hi there, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning to our folks who are joining from the West Coast. I am Jeremiah Johnson. I'm Associate Professor in Civil Construction and Environmental Engineering at North Carolina State University, and I'm going to serve as the moderator today for this Macro Energy Systems panel. So thank you all for joining. We have nearly 100 registrants for this event, where we'll be talking about communicating uncertainty in macro energy systems models. Just as a brief plug for our next event, thank you all for finding your way here. We will have more and continued panels in the near future. The next one that is scheduled for March is on the topic of sustainable finance in macro energy system models. But onto today's task at hand. So we'll be talking about communicating uncertainty in our models, and we have an absolutely stellar panel today. This is a difficult and important topic related to uncertainty, technological change, and innovation, and how these factors can and should play a role in how we use the outputs of our macro energy system models. How do we communicate what we know and what we don't know? Our models have multi-decadal time horizons. Technologies evolve considerably over these time periods, and characterizing and effectively communicating this uncertainty is essential to make sure that we provide the most value possible and that our recommendations are robust. Fortunately, we have three very distinguished scholars here today who have agreed to participate in this panel discussion. I'm going to take a few minutes to provide a brief bio for each of them. We'll have some opening remarks, followed by Q&A led by me, but I'll be sure to save some time for an open discussion for audience questions. The way that we'll do this, you can enter questions directly, and then I will curate the questions and try to get it to as many as I can that hit topics that we have not yet covered in the structured Q&A from me. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our three panelists. Up first, we have Dr. Leslie Abrahams, who is the Director of Energy Systems Analysis at the Clean Air Task Force. Her work centers on assessing and managing the risk and feasibility of a zero carbon energy transition. Prior to joining the Clean Air Task Force, Leslie worked as a research staff member at the Science and Technology Policy Institute, where she worked with White House Office of Science and Technology Policy to develop interagency strategies to advance R&D related to energy, environment, and natural hazard resilience. Our second panelist is Dr. Joseph Decarolis, who is the current administrator of the U.S. Energy Information Administration. At the EIA, he leads efforts for the agency to serve as the premier source of independent, impartial energy information in the U.S. and oversees a wide range of statistical, analytical, and dissemination activities related to the energy sector. Before his appointment as administrator, Joe served as a professor in my department, the Department of Civil Construction, Environmental Engineering at North Carolina State University. And before that, served as an environmental scientist at the U.S. EPA's Office of Research and Development. And our third panelist is Dr. Naga Srujana Goteti, who is the technical lead at the Electric Power Research Institute. And as we all know, EPRI is a premier nonprofit energy research, development, and deployment organization with deep influence in industry, deep influence in the public sector. Srujana conducts analysis on electricity markets, energy storage, and integration of renewables. Her doctoral research at the Rochester Institute of Technology and postdoctoral research at MIT used novel methods to provide insights into the emission impacts of a rapidly changing grid. So I'm very, very grateful to have our panelists' time today, and very excited to begin this discussion in earnest. So I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists to provide a brief remarks in response to why they accepted our invitation to attend. So you accepted our invitation to speak on this topic of communicating uncertainty to decision makers related to macro energy system models. Why is this topic worth your time and attention? And Leslie, if you would provide your response first, please.
Sure. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me on this panel. And this topic is absolutely critical to the work that we do at Clean Air Task Force. And my program in particular, called Energy Systems Analysis, we focus on how to make sure that our planning for decarbonization is feasible, reliable, and actually implementable. And what that means to me is that what we are thinking about when we're developing our plans is to make sure that our plans are not just mathematically possible, but practically implementable in the real world. And so, of course, uncertainty and how we communicate that uncertainty is such a big part of that work and that effort. And kind of among other things, some of the ways that we think about communicating that uncertainty is placing the energy system within the broader context of our social systems, and to think about all of the important interactions and interconnectedness across all of our different systems. And so when we go to build infrastructure or think about citing different components of our energy system, or even thinking about kind of demand flexibility and response, we have to think about not just the uncertainty parameters that we typically think about in techno-economic models, like cost and learning curves, but we also have to think about the uncertainty of people and how people's values differ, regionally, even from person to person within the same area. And we have to think about people's behaviors and uncertainty associated with what people care about and what their different values and priorities are when it comes to deciding what our plans should be based on. And that's not always cost minimization or optimization. So the uncertainty of the place of the energy system within our social system is one of our big focus areas. Another important focus area is thinking about interactive tools and frameworks and other things that we can help use to not just tell policymakers and decision makers about uncertainty, but to really put it into their hands so they can put their own questions, their own values, and their own judgments into a tool and see how what they care about impacts the outcomes. And then kind of the third key area we focus on related to uncertainty is risk and robust decision making. And of course, we want to make sure that the decisions we make today are going to withstand, unpredictable changes, future climate states, things that we don't even know to think about today. So as you can see, this topic is very important to me and to the work that we do at CETF. So I'm very happy to be here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Leslie. I really appreciate your call to think about uncertainty beyond the traditional bounds of our models and uncertainty, not just in the parameters that we include. Up next, Joe. So could you please share why this topic was worth your time and attention, why you accepted our invitation to discuss this topic?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Jeremiah. This topic is something that I've worked on basically from the beginning of my academic career. It's something I think is really important. And the reason is, anytime we build a model of the energy system, the real world energy system is incredibly complex, right? There's a lot of technological detail, but as Leslie indicated, there's also human behavior involved. We've got millions, billions of people making individual decisions that in one way or another affect the energy system. And so whatever kind of model we build is going to be a gross simplification of reality. And models can really help us develop, I think, some critical insights to help us anticipate things that might happen in the energy system, to identify pitfalls of future policy. But we have to be really careful with how we apply the models, because there's a way in which we can apply the models and actually generate results that are potentially misleading. And I think the way that we avoid that is doing the best we can to assess uncertainty. And that means that when we produce model insights, they have to be conditioned on a consideration of uncertainty in some way. And exactly how we address that uncertainty, it really depends on the question that you're trying to address, computational intensity of the method, and how difficult it is to communicate that uncertainty to your stakeholders. But it's all very important. And I think consideration of uncertainty is also part of a bigger challenge of taking the model results that exist kind of in model land and then mapping them to the real world, right? That's like a very, very important step with the modeling work that we need to apply as modelers. How do we take these model specific results and then run them through a filter where we can identify, this is, maybe some of these things are modeling artifacts. We want to kind of discount that aspect of a result. But these other things we think are actually robust to the real world, and we need to think further about them. So I think for a lot of reasons, considering uncertainty and energy modeling is a really, really important topic.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joe. I appreciate the call for both thoroughness and humility in this space as we interpret, ensuring that our results are robust to the uncertainties that our models present. Excellent. And Srujana, could you offer why did you accept this invitation? Why is this topic worth your time?
First of all, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm very excited to be here. Leslie and Joe covered a lot of points that could overlap with what I'm saying, but nevertheless, we are in the same panel, so I think we all resonate same thoughts. Uncertainty is very close to my heart, and I did a lot of that work during my PhD. And after joining EPRI, our group works very closely with resource planners. And I do want to reiterate one point that Joe just mentioned is, when I was talking about these principles, the big gap or the question that existed was, how do we map these to the real world problems? And generally, when I work with these resource planners, the 4 broad steps of a resource planning in general is identifying resources, what resources, developing scenarios, optimizing, and testing the robustness. All these steps have uncertainties. And what we observe so far is the resource planners generally consider robustness post-optimization. So trying to convey or find methods that could incorporate these issues from the beginning to make them realize that optimal portfolios can be found if you consider uncertainty from the beginning, then robustness, and then is something I'm most interested in. And today I'm very excited to talk about like the challenges or really trying to empathize with what they face while including these principles, and also some of the things we could do to help them embrace uncertainty in long-term planning, because anything in 20 years horizon comprises uncertainty and there's no escape from that. It's how we want to embrace and include that in the planning is important, especially while trying to decarbonize the systems.
Oh, thank you, Srujana. I appreciate this call for thinking about uncertainty from the beginning and through this application of integrated resources planning, where you have to make decisions. You can't simply decide that it is too uncertain, that you need to interpret subject to the limitations you have. It's a really important application of this question. Thank you. Before I jump into the Q&A, I want to make sure that I take a moment to acknowledge a few folks that have made this panel possible. So Arnav Gautam is a PhD student who is serving this year as a Macroenergy Systems Fellow. Thank you, Arnav, so much for making this panel happen. It was Arnav's brainchild and brought the panelists together and really has made this happen. I would also like to give a thank you to Polly Ann from Stanford, who has been instrumental in the logistics and the support for this panel. And more broadly, the leadership across the Macroenergy Systems Society that has supported this panel series among other events. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to direct this first question to Joe. So in your role at the EIA, your agency plays a key role in informing policy decisions that greatly impact the economy, greatly impact the environment. How should we approach balancing this trade-off between complexity and uncertainty analysis? And maybe even more specifically, how does your agency approach communicating limitations in data and uncertainty in analysis that reflects what is known, what is unknown, without undercutting the primary value of these assets?
Okay, that's a big topic. So I guess taking the first part, this trade-off between complexity and uncertainty. I think in general, we want to make models only as complex as they need to be, right? So ideally, we want models that are parsimonious. And whatever sophistication there is in the model, it's because we're trying to model key market dynamics that need to be there in order to address whatever question it is that we're asking. And whatever that complexity ends up being within the model, it shouldn't get in the way of our ability to do uncertainty analysis. So we don't want to be in a situation where we create a model that's so top heavy that it can't be used to do, you can't iterate the model in order to do proper uncertainty analysis. And that's a real challenge. It's something that we're dealing with at EIA. We have enormously sophisticated models, but the challenge is, again, trying to use them in a way to do uncertainty analysis. So we've been, trying to find different ways. We can get into specific methods later in the panel, but it's definitely something that we're working on. And I think with regard to with regard to communication, I think it's just really important to be transparent about what you find as a modeler. And so what that means to me is you don't just, again, it's part of this interpretation layer to the analysis. So you produce the model results, but you also talk about how those results map to the real world. That inevitably means having to talk about caveats associated with your analysis. And when you communicate that, you need to be as specific as possible, right? So if you say something very generic, like, hey, this is just a simple model, so, be careful, right? That kind of undercuts the entire study. So when you're communicating, you want to communicate about uncertainty and acknowledge it and talk about the limitations. But two, you want to be as specific as possible about where those limitations are and how and speculate about how you think they might affect the analysis.
That's great. Thank you, Joe. So the next question I have is for Srujana. Recent deployment of large-scale energy storage changes our power system. It changes operations and planning in some fundamental ways. And this is just one example of kind of a shock to the planning system. You mentioned integrated resources planning in your response to my first question. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on what are some of the challenges in including and communicating uncertainties, especially setting up these models for future decarbonization scenarios where we may have these big step changes and big differences that our current models may be somewhat inadequate to reflect.
So energy storage is an excellent example. And recently I was doing some model with deep decarbonization policies. And in the end, there's a considerable capacity of energy storage, wind and solar. And then the resource planners do ask me, well, do we have enough wind and solar to charge energy storage? So the questions about uncertainty are coming up more and more because of such decarbonization policies in the future. The challenges generally we've observed so far are, Joe covered some of these and just wanted to point them out as computationally burdensome to apply to the real world problems, especially when these planners want to consider transmission, zonal representation, and unit level representation. These are pretty computationally burdensome as you add more and more layers of like distributions and other uncertainty parameters. The other important parameter that I noticed personally is gap in literature, where what we find in peer-reviewed journals are too academic, which the modelers don't want to adopt as resource planners. And what we want to publish that could be useful to the resource planners is too simple for academic literature, where personally, even for me, I got these comments from the reviewers saying this is too simple in terms of what it contributes to the literature. So there is this gap of complexity in academic world versus somewhat simpler models that the resource planners could use while trying to implement uncertainty. The third point, the most important one is most of them are not aware of stochastic methods in general because somewhere they compartmentalize it as too complex. So I think the uncertainty methods that I noticed generally were Monte Carlo analysis at the most. But even if you consider a simple two-stage stochastic optimization, for anyone who's not aware, it does give an optimal solution in near term with a future recourse decisions or possible outcomes for various future scenarios. But as a resource planner, they want a path in long term. They want some defined path for next 20 or 30 years. So somewhere we did have this challenge of how do we adopt these two-stage stochastic optimization problems to them. I'm not saying that's the only method. There are several methods. But as far as their knowledge goes, Monte Carlo first, and if anything beyond that is two-stage stochastic optimization. So these are some of the challenges. And the last challenge is probabilities. They're like, we don't know how to communicate these probabilities to our stakeholders. Like, how do we even justify these numbers? So this is also one of the challenges or a barrier for them to adopt uncertainty because they want to be transparent to stakeholders, and somewhere how do they be transparent if they don't have solid methods to communicate these probabilistic numbers?
Well, I appreciate that greatly. And then thinking about the IRP process, the process itself can be contentious, and I can readily imagine candid expressions of uncertainty can be used against those who make those claims. And so is there a balance? Is there a way that folks responsible for producing and running an IRP process can both be candid about what is unknown or the uncertainty or the range of possible outcomes, while still not inviting a critique that undercuts the whole argument? And I realize that's that is the problem at times. But have you seen practices that have done a good job without leaving one exposed to these really deep critiques?
One example I could think of is like having the data, historical data could help them. And I've seen that hydro-based utility companies, which have like a good historical data of hydro availability, do good uncertainty analysis because they have to consider hydro availability as part of their resource portfolio to understand what to build in the future. So in that case, they consider uncertainty. They have hydro availability from 1930 or 1920s. They do everything, consider a good sample, and then do the uncertainty analysis as they should. So I think somewhere it depends on like how much effort goes into gathering transparent data. And as long as they're able to justify it, I think they're okay with that. But it's not possible for every utility company to do.
No, I appreciate that, and I really like that point of how much history you have does influence what you can do. When we're talking about future uncertainties of technologies that aren't widespread, that does feel fundamentally different than a hydropower based utility. Thank you, I appreciate that. Oh, so next question is for Leslie here. Some of your work has focused on the need for technology diversity when addressing climate change. We can imagine a situation where we run a macro energy system model that shows that a single technology can really do it all or do a lot. It's the lowest cost. It effectively mitigates greenhouse gases. But fundamentally, we might be hesitant to suggest this single technology solution. Why should we value diversity of technologies as we change in our energy system, and how does uncertainty come into play here?
Well, there are so many reasons why we should value diversity and technology diversity. And I think the first thing that I want to acknowledge is that we're not just talking about uncertainty when it comes to energy system and energy modeling. We're really talking about deep uncertainty. makes a deep uncertainty is that there are so many unknown unknowns that even additional research, while it might help us understand different parts of the system, we can't fundamentally mitigate that uncertainty. And so when I think of technology diversity as a tool, I know this panel is about communicating uncertainty, but to me, this is really a means of safeguarding us against this deep uncertainty. And, from the highest level, I would say that technology diversity is important because as Joe mentioned earlier, we have to recognize our humility as people and our limitations of knowledge and our own biases. And we have to acknowledge that we can't just pick a winner and decide that that's going to be kind of the best technology that's all. And planning, what we really want to do in order to make sure that we have kind of robust decisions around our implementation and pathways is to think about how we can have adaptive and flexible pathways. And so even if we go down one road of a specific technology or portfolio of technologies being kind of our vision of what is going to work best in a certain context, we need to have alternatives ready and available to be deployed in case there's an unforeseen change in the system in the future. And so that flexibility and ability to adapt is really driven by our having a diversity of technologies, in our portfolio. I think we also have to recognize, kind of going back to what I said earlier about there being this broader social context, that there are different geographies, there are different cultures, there are different kind of political discourses that are happening globally. And we can't assume that one technology pathway that works in one instance is going to work everywhere. And similarly, even though one pathway, one portfolio might be the least cost solution to a model, we need to recognize that least cost isn't going to be everybody's priority. And especially as we start to get from, is transitioning to a decarbonized energy system possible, to how do we do this and how do we implement this? We have to recognize that we might be moving away from cost as a driver to multiple objectives and multiple values being the driver. And from a more mathematical standpoint, I would also say that there's something called concentration risk when you are too invested in one portfolio or one pathway. What you start to see is reliance on compound probability. And so when you're describing a scenario, what you're essentially saying is there's a series of things that have to happen. So we need to develop this much solar, and we have to develop this much transmission capacity, and we need this much short duration storage, this much long duration storage, and this many EVs. And what happens is, as that compound probability chain kind of increases in length, any one of those things going wrong basically creates a larger threat to your overall success. So those are just a few reasons, but certainly technology diversity is important, both from a kind of philosophical standpoint, a risk standpoint, and a mathematical standpoint of increasing our chance of success.
That is great. That is great. Thank you, Leslie. I'd like to open up the floor to any panelists who has an example they would like to share. What tools or methods do you find most effective in communicating complex information about uncertainties in macro energy systems? Are there any kind of exemplars that you hold up, or specific case studies or tests that you thought worked really well in balancing this need to communicate uncertainty while not undercutting the robust conclusions that should be drawn?
Yes, I can jump in. I don't, you know, I don't know that I can say there are exemplars. I really, the way that I think about addressing uncertainty is I want to have a big toolkit, right? A big toolbox. And then depending on what the question is I'm trying to answer with the model, I can reach into my toolbox and pick the right method to address that particular question. So I don't look at it as, one method is superior to another, but there is one that I thought was worth mentioning and something that we've begun to incorporate in our annual energy outlook. One of the challenges we face there is that the NEMS model is really complex and it is computationally intensive and it's hard to iterate. So one of the things we did was we built on a method that was outlined by CAC et al. So this was a method that we developed, but CAC et al. Had applied empirical prediction intervals to AEO results, and we kind of took that and then also applied it in our last edition of the AEO. What I like about this is it's a good fit for our need because you don't actually have to iterate the model a bunch of times. What you do is you look at past projections, and at EIA we have lots of those lying around because we've been doing the AEO for four decades, and you look at the delta between what those past projections said and what actually happened, right? So then you can form a distribution of those, we'll call them errors, but I mean those like in a statistical sense, right? The difference between what we projected and what actually happened. And then you can form those distributions based on the time frame, right? So like how far you would have a different distribution based on how far into the future that projection was. And you can use that information to form a cone of uncertainty. And then you can use that, and it's very much like the cone you would see associated with a hurricane track. And we can then take that cone and then apply it to our AEO projections looking out into the future. So we can take our AEO projections from 2023, apply that cone that was developed based on looking at this historical data and get a sense for, how might things change into the future. And what's really nice about it, in addition to not having to iterate the model, is it also accounts for structural uncertainties in the model. So there might be, for example, we don't account for future policy in our AEO cases, but inevitably, right, in past editions of the AEO, new policy was introduced after we released a particular edition. And so that might, for example, bias our emissions results. And by taking this approach, you actually account for any past bias, and you start to get a sense for, okay, well, the reference case or particular case might say something, but what might actually happen based on historically how much difference there was between what actually happened and what we said in our projection.
That is excellent, Joe. And is this use of this method available? Is this something that folks in the audience can take a look at and see the performance, or is this work that's underway?
So I would definitely point folks to the CAC et al. Paper. I can't remember the publication year, but I want to say it was like around 2016 or 2017. It was published in PNAS. And then we've just started to use EIA. So if you actually look in the 2023 edition of the AEO, right towards the end of the report, we actually applied their method to look at future CO2 emissions.
Excellent, thank you. Srujana, Leslie, anything to add to this question?
Personally, I can't think of a tool to exemplify, but I can add one thing. What could be useful is these resource planners depend a lot on the commercial tools, and anything that can add on to implement stochastic model around these commercial tools could really enable them to consider uncertainty, because they have these legacy setups that happen over years, which they're generally hesitant to change. So at least if there are any add-ons that could be applied to the tools they already use, I think that could be most beneficial to implement uncertainty.
Okay. Okay, so my next question, from your perspective, what are the primary concerns or priorities of decision makers when it comes to macro energy systems? And how can we align our communication strategies around uncertainty to meet these needs? So kind of thinking with the end use in mind. And the last answers, I think, speak to this to some extent, but are there ways that we can tailor or limit or expand our communication strategies, particularly with these needs in mind?
Just to clarify, by communicating, do you mean like communicating the results or communicating the problem to the modelers or whoever wants to implement uncertainty?
Communicating the uncertainties that speak to their concerns, their needs, and I think that is a broad question in that it depends on what who the stakeholder is. So the needs look different if we're talking about integrated resources planning versus a different stakeholder. Leslie, I saw that you unmuted. Did you have thoughts on
I
this?
can jump in and talk about this from the perspective of some of the things that I've been thinking about and my program works on. But I think one key need of decision makers is just speed. Like a lot of times these dialogues and conversations are happening very quickly. There's a lot of changes. Like if you think about a legislation that's being written, it's constant negotiation and compromise and tweaking one thing and changing another thing. And a decision maker needs to know kind of at that pace of dialogue, how these different changes affect outcomes and expected pace of decarbonization and other consequences. And so one thing I would encourage everyone listening to think about is there are kind of two different ways of thinking about researching uncertainty. And one is trying to really understand it from a theoretical context and improving how we treat uncertainty in our models, and really, expanding our scope and abilities to do that. But another way of thinking about uncertainty, and I think this is especially relevant for how we communicate it, is if we could get decision makers to understand just a few things that are going to have the biggest impact on kind of the robustness of the decisions they're making, what are those things? So for example, if it is a better, more robust framework for scenario use in how we model, that might not be the most advanced state of the art, academic thing that we could do to best quantify and understand uncertainty, but to a decision maker, that might be the thing that gets them or makes them more capable and ready to have these kind of ongoing conversations. And so thinking about kind of what are those like low-hanging fruits that don't take a year to configure a model, run a model, get the results, iterate, but instead can really be put in the hands of decision makers kind of in those moments. So that's one thing that I would offer.
Excellent. Anticipate needs, respond quickly, focus on the few things that matter. I love that. Any other thoughts, Joe, Srujana?
I can jump in. Like when you first asked the question, I actually immediately went back to what Leslie had said earlier about, uncertainty, not just in some of the technical aspects of the energy system, but on people. And I think sometimes decision makers, what they really want to know is some of the things that are the hardest to model, right? So they want to know job impacts. They want to know what the impact is going to be on their stakeholders. And I think the further we drill down, the bigger the uncertainty gets, right? So it's easier to do, I'd say easier in air quotes, to do, national scale projections that are aggregated at that level than it is to like come up with a robust insight in what's going to happen in, within someone's district. And the models can produce the results, right, with high granularity. But again, getting back to the uncertainty, what are the, what are the robust insights? And I think it's a challenge. I mean, my sense is that the energy modeling community is in a period of rapid evolution, and we're all trying to figure out, how do we expand the range of outputs that we're producing while still trying to address this uncertainty.
Thank you, Joe.
One thing I would like to add to Leslie's point is the two keywords that struck to me were speed and low-hanging fruit. And generally, that's where the barrier is, right? Like many planners take time to generate these distributions because they really don't know, even at macro scale, how to construct these distributions. So if we have any publicly data available of these drivers from reputable sources, I think that could at least solve some of the things as like, what are those things that have biggest impact and what those uncertainties are. And if that could be downloaded or taken from a reputable source to give them that confidence, rather than trying to individually model for each case each time.
Yeah, no, I appreciate this, and thinking back, I had spent time working in industry doing power market modeling, where we were helping folks make decisions related to buying, building, selling, retiring power plants and transmission lines. And I recall distinctly running scenarios with high natural gas prices, mid natural gas prices, and low natural gas prices. And this was pre-fracking. This was quite some time ago, and we were completely caught flat-footed to what low could mean. And kind of back to Leslie's point of what are the unknown unknowns, and I feel like that was an experience for us there, where $2 per MMBTU natural gas wasn't something that was taken seriously, and then it was the reality. Joe, I appreciate your comments on how the method that you discussed can capture some of that structural uncertainty. I'd love to hear more examples of how we can stretch both our methods and our communication of that uncertainty, not just for minor variations in our parameters, but these step changes that do happen, and we never quite know when they're going to happen or how they're going to happen. So how do we approach these big things, both from a modeling point of view, but also from this communication point of view? How do we keep the humility in our communication of results when these unknown unknowns or these step function changes are, again, probably just around the corner?
That's a good question. I don't have a good answer to that. I think it's really hard. But what I can say is you have to, in order to figure out how you can best address that, you have to know what you got wrong in the past. So that's one of the things we're working on pretty hard at EIA is benchmarking. So we have the benefit of, well, depending, I guess, how you look at it, we have a long history. So that same data that we use to construct those uncertainty cones, we can use for benchmarking exercise, right? So we can say, like, for each AEO edition across the cases, this was the range. We're also doing the same thing in the short-term energy outlook, which only covers, the next couple of years. And there are lots of cases where the range based on our model projections does this, in reality did this or did that. And you have to ask questions about, like, what did we get wrong? Now, going through that exercise, I think, is extremely helpful. It doesn't guarantee that you're going to be able to identify the future unknowns, right? Because the world is very dynamic. It's evolving in different ways. So even if you shore up your model to reflect, a past surprise, there's no guarantee that you're going to get it right moving forward. But I still think, doing the benchmarking exercise, that sort of reflection on what did I get right, what did I get wrong, and why, does help make us better modelers.
Leslie?
Yeah, something that I think is interesting and often reflect on is that we see these events like, hydraulic fracturing becoming economically viable and changing the dynamics of our fossil fuel market as being kind of one-off surprises. But I think really when we think about our world, it actually is really dominated kind of like by these extreme and like improbable things. And we are more comfortable, like as humans, thinking about the things that we know and have been repeated in our experiences. And so I think that like what that means to me is that we need to think about what is how we see the world blinding us to. And I think not just studying uncertainty, but really like acknowledging that we exist in a world of uncertainty. And kind of with that, we were talking about communicating uncertainty and this trade-off of complexity. And one of the things that I worry about kind of associated with this like Black Swan event context is that if we simplify uncertainty too much, and I think not just from a standpoint of the numbers, but really the whole theory of uncertainty, what that risks is that decision makers will have overconfidence in the decisions that they make. And I think that this all goes back to not just how do we incorporate uncertainty, but how do we think about minimizing risk and minimizing regret about the decisions that we're making.
All right, I'm going to make sure that I save some time for questions. So I'm going to actually ask a couple of the audience questions, and anyone who is any participants who would like to contribute, please feel free to add a question. We will do our best to get through as many as possible. The first one that I'd like to ask, apologies if I'm mispronouncing the name, but from Shatiz Kanal, what are some frameworks you use to estimate propagation of uncertainty in energy modeling? Do they include uncertainty from model inputs? And what are strategies you use in communicating uncertainty in peer-reviewed research and in stakeholder engagement? Okay, so kind of multi-part question of error of propagation. So a methods question. Do they include uncertainty in model inputs, and then different strategies for communicating uncertainty, whether we're speaking to an academic audience or a non-academic audience? Srujana, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. So I'll start with communicating in peer-reviewed research and stakeholder engagement. I mean, personally, it's a huge difference because there have been instances where I had to explain like what does a box plot really communicate in terms of like when I'm showing a box plot of distributions, what does it really communicate? And I think there's no simple answer or solution on how you want to simplify this communication. But in general, I think improvising the knowledge to the decision makers on uncertainty in general could help break that barrier a bit. And Joe touched upon excellent points, and many of them look up to AEO to get the values. And if they can find anything related to like how these distributions can be modeled, or like I mentioned before, reputable data sources that could maybe help in building that knowledge to the decision makers. But there's no simple answer on what strategies to use. But there's a gap for sure which I want to acknowledge between academic peer-reviewed papers and stakeholder engagement. Yeah, so I don't think I gave a straight answer, but there's no straight answer.
that is an honest answer.
I have an example of an approach that I found useful that I'll just share. This was from I guess quite a few years ago now, but I was researching the emissions impacts from coal versus natural gas. And if anyone who has worked in this field knows that there is kind of a contentious debate about a key parameter, and that is methane leakage.
Yes.
And so the approach that I took in kind of communicating the uncertainty and impact of the uncertainty was to think about thresholds and threshold effects. So instead of saying like, this is the methane leakage rate that I think, and based on the literature, and here's the distribution, but to also say, here is the point at which a leakage rate will change your decision of whether coal or natural gas has the higher emissions rate. And so what that allows is for a decision maker to think about their level of confidence that, you know, where if they think that will reach that threshold, and kind of removes from the conversation the debate about the leakage rate itself.
Excellent. I love it. This idea of threshold effects and thresholds at which your decision changes. So keeping the decision centered too. That's great. I'm going to jump to the next question here, unless Joe, you.
I was just really quick, just on the first part of the question in terms of frameworks. Like as we've been discussing, there's lots of different tools out there. One useful distinction that I think about is with uncertainty propagation is, are you propagating the uncertainty through the model and then generating multiple results? Or are you trying to embed the uncertainty into the model to produce a single result? So the first category where you're propagating the uncertainty through, that would be, you know, things like scenario analysis. If you're doing parametric sensitivity analysis, Monte Carlo simulation, you do a single model run, you make some assumptions at the beginning, you run it through the model, you get a result, and then in the end you get a bunch of results, and then you have to figure out how to analyze that. The second category would involve things like stochastic optimization or robust optimization. The advantage there is that you're embedding the uncertainty into the formulation, so you get a single answer. But the challenge, and Srujana mentioned this earlier, is just it gets computationally very intensive, and you're very limited in terms of what uncertainty you can model in that way. So I find that to be kind of a useful distinction in terms of methods.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. I'm going to offer the next question from Cameron Lizzie. How are you incorporating flexibility into your models to respond to structural uncertainty? So here meaning more flexible design that can update quickly to incorporate changing conditions that may not have been initially considered. So back to our earlier point, you know, speed matters. So are there ways that you have seen or that you have done that incorporate this flexibility to allow you to be responsive to changing conditions?
I'm happy to jump in unless Srujana or
Joe.
Leslie. Okay, so I mean, there's lots of ways to do this. I'll give you three methods that come to mind. One is and I should say this is also informed by work we're doing at EIA. We're developing a next generation energy system model that will eventually replace NEMS. And so we're thinking really hard about this. One is if you have a modular model structure, you can actually have different versions of the same module with different levels of complexity. So that you can kind of piece together the model with detail in particular areas, again, depending on the question that you're trying to address. That's a way to address structural uncertainty, basically remove the detail or add the detail to the structure of the model, depending on what you're trying to do. Another is a method called MGA, and I won't get into all the details, but if it works with mostly with linear models, where you're actually changing the formulation of the objective function in a way that does an efficient search of the decision space. That's another way to account for structural uncertainty. And then third is you just run different models, right? So Stanford EMF will pull together different modeling teams, ask them to use harmonized assumptions, and then you get to see what, how the results vary across models. That's another way of dealing with structural uncertainty, because when you run different models with different governing dynamics or different math, you get to see how the results differ.
Thank you.
I was exactly thinking about modular models in my mind, and surprised that Joe used the exact word. Yes, I think modularity could add a lot of value, especially because, reiterating my last point, many of these planners use commercial tools. So if you could add any modularity in generating input distributions that can go into these commercial tools and have reporting tools separately that can report these distributions, that could enhance the speed considerably, because they already have the tool set up, they know how to do things, and having an add-on to those tools could help some part of flexibility. And we at EPRI did the third method too, like comparing different models to see how the results could change, and if there's any theme you can see at macro level that's somewhat similar between these models. So MGA is one other model we used as well in the past. So just reiterating what Joe just mentioned from my experience.
So next question, George Moraitis. How do we consider geopolitical concerns in our energy systems modeling? And do you anticipate that becoming a more important stakeholder concern in the future? So in some ways, one of the biggest unknown unknowns, but we see it play out over and over again. How should we consider the uncertainty introduced by these global geopolitical events in a manner that really does impact our answers, but are wholesale unpredictable?
I guess I'll answer first.
Sure, thank you.
I think this, I agree that this is very important, and I think it'll only become increasingly important in the future. And to me, this goes back to the idea of not just focusing on least cost as the parameter for us making our decisions and planning around. And so I think this goes into how do we, one, incorporate kind of social and political concerns into our techno-economic modeling so that we can try to get a more holistic picture of the realities that we're trying to model. But then also, what are the off-model and characteristics that we should be thinking about that maybe are difficult to quantify or shouldn't be quantified? And I think as modelers, we have to recognize that it's also our responsibility to bring other stakeholders into that conversation and to acknowledge what can't or shouldn't be modeled. And so we can think through kind of how to navigate and facilitate the dialogue of our modeling results, but also with some of these kind of off-model parameters. And one approach that we've been thinking about is also using MGA, a method for generating alternatives. And that's where, you can basically have this broader portfolio of solutions, and you can calculate different impacts across different parameters, and actually in real time do trade-offs of about, if you're worried about a certain geopolitical risk, if you want to minimize that, how does that then propagate through and change the portfolios of solutions that are remaining that address your objective while also minimizing that specific parameter?
It sounds immensely powerful and very important, given that we see these things play out over and over again. We are almost out of time. I want to thank all of our panelists so much. Is there any comment that was that any panelist would like to add at the end, a topic that we missed, that a hole left in the questions?
One point I'd like to mention is, like, there's no one standard method for applying uncertainty. It's a very much case-to-case basis. So maybe a simple Monte Carlo could be sufficient for your own case, or you might need to do a sophisticated analysis if your risk is higher. So I think it's a lot dependent on case-to-case basis.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that comment. I think it's a great one for us to end with, and for the students out there or for the researchers out there. I mean, I think it goes without saying how important this topic is and how valuable and useful advancement of methods and communication of results and thoughtful interpretation is. I think it's important for our society to continue to push the bounds on this, continue to ask and answer these questions. So again, I want to thank our panelists so much for their time. We really do appreciate your time and your expertise in this. Thank you to Arnav and Polly for making this happen. And please be on the lookout for our March event. We will do our best to advertise it early, and I'm sure we will bring together as excellent a panelists as we did today. So thank you all.